quit drinking? Do I keep drinking? I don't mean drinking something wrong. I mean just drinking. I mean, but what do I eat? How much do I eat? I mean, there's a lot of decisions that go into things sometimes, and that's a lot. Decisions are very important. They determine the path of life that we're going to take. They determine the way that we're going to travel. They determine our final destination. Where are we going to end up? Today I want to start by telling you a story. This is a story about 3 men. All of them were originally from Macon. One moved to Perry, one moved to Byron, and the other one lived in Macon. They went to high school together in Macon, and they all became just like lifelong friends. But as life would have it, after you get out of high school, people kind of go their separate ways. They get married, they have a family, they do different things. But these guys still stayed in touch with each other and decided, you know what? It would be great just to go on a trip with each other and just kind of talk about old times and just rekindle an old relationship. And so they decided to go on a hike in the desert Southwest. That's probably not a good destination from 3 guys from Macon, okay? They wasn't prepared. They didn't carry enough water, didn't carry enough food. The second day they were on their hike, they realized that the coyotes had done gotten into their food. So even what food they carried, they still didn't have as much as they had at one time. Their water supply was dwindling away really fast because it was hot in the desert, hotter than they expected it to be. And they were all starting to kind of dehydrate and all those kind of things. And so they were running out of water really fast. They didn't have any idea where the next water supply was. And they started to think, you know what? We may be in trouble. So the next day, they were traveling along, and one of them ran out of water. The other 2 were sharing what they had with each other, so they started limiting how much they were drinking, right? But in the distance, they saw an old cabin. So they finally made their way to it. It took them longer to get there than they thought, because they could see further than normal, right? Out in the flatlands of the Southwest. So they finally got there, and it was an old stagecoach station. Where stagecoaches would stop and resupply with horses and food, and the passengers would take a break before they would head over the Rockies. And so they went inside. There was a well out front. It was dry. They went inside. There were some canned foods in there from years and years ago, but the seals had been broken on the jars, and so the food was just spoiled. And so they all just sat on the floor looking at each other, backs against the walls, just wondering what's next. And then they heard a noise coming from the back of the cabin. And there was an old lady that showed up. And they jumped to their feet and, man, this is great. They jumped to their feet and she said, I don't have any food or water. But what I can do is grant each one of you one wish. One wish. So the guy from Byron said, hey, you know what? I ain't got nothing else left. If this is true, I just wish that I could go back to Byron. Just put me back in Byron right now, where my family is, and I have food and water in abundance. And I have the love of my family around me. And bam, he was gone. The guy from Perry looked at this in like amazement. He goes, wow, did this really happen? He goes, you know what? I want what he had. I want to go back home. I miss the farm fields of Perry and the trees and my family and all the water and food and all the relationships that I had there. And bam, he was gone. And the guy from Macon was sitting there in utter amazement. I mean, he was just wild-eyed. He was going, I can't believe this. And in panic and in desperation, he said, I just want my friends back. Don't you know that they could kill him? We have to be careful of what we wish for. We have to be careful of the decisions and the choices we make in life, because they can be a great impact on where life leads and where life ends. Today, we're going to take a look at a man who made a tremendous decision in life. We're going to be looking in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning with verse 23 if you want to read along. I'm just going to read one verse at a time and kind of expand on those a little bit. But this man's name was Moses. The story of Moses is actually found in the book of Exodus, but he's brought up in the book of Hebrews in chapter 11. This is known as the Hall of Faith, or the chapter of faith, where it just lists people, men and women, who are great in faith in the Bible. And there's a reason for all those people being there. Verse 23, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. The king being the Pharaoh of Egypt. You know, when the Hebrew people first went to Israel, they were Jacob's offspring. And they went there because their brother Joseph brought them there. And we go back and read that story of how all that evolved. This happens about 300 years after that. This is the king Pharaoh of Egypt, that didn't know Joseph. He didn't know the history of these people. But these people had grown to be so much in multitude and so strong in the country of Egypt that he was afraid of them. And so they were actually slaves in Egypt, but he was afraid of them. And his fear came from the fact that there were just so many of them. They outnumbered some of the Egyptians in some parts of where they were at. And these people still carried the stories of God with them. They still passed it on from generation to generation. They wasn't afraid of Pharaoh. They wasn't afraid of what he would do because they had trust in God and they had confidence in God. But Moses' mom and dad wasn't afraid of what might happen to them, but they didn't want their baby done away with. Pharaoh's edict was this. He told all the midwives that when these Hebrew women have a child, if he's a male, kill him. Does that sound familiar? Kind of happened in Jesus' time too, right? We're back to kill all the male children. But at this time, he was trying to keep the Hebrew people from becoming more powerful. And so that was his edict. But it didn't work. The midwives didn't really do that. They came back and said, you know what? These Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're just having these babies without us there. And so we don't know where all the male children are at. But his mom and dad put him in a basket and hid him in the reeds in the river. It's a pretty amazing story. But Pharaoh's daughter found him. But her soft heart for this little baby, she wanted to bring him in to be her own child. Let's continue reading with verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So Pharaoh's daughter brought him into her house. The amazing thing, if you go back and read the events that took place, his mother ends up being his nanny or his carer, right? She's the one that raised him up. So she has an opportunity to teach him all about this great God that they've all talked about all their life. She raised him up in the ways of the Hebrew people, and she's saying, Moses, you're not really one of them. You're not one of the Egyptians. You're a Hebrew. And she taught him about all that. And all of this resided in his heart. But did you notice what it says in this verse, 24? When he was grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Moses was 40 years old when he made this decision. He had lived in Pharaoh's palace for 40 years. He'd been taught the things of the Hebrew people. He had been taught the things of the Egyptians. Moses was educated in the finest schools. He was taught to be royalty. He knew how to go before a king. He knew how to talk to the highest ranking people in Israel or in Egypt. Moses was being prepared for a great mission. He didn't realize that at the time. But that's exactly what God was doing. But I want you to listen to this. He chose rather to be mistreated with the people of God because of the things his mother was telling him. He had two mamas. He had Pharaoh's daughter, and he had his real mother. One was telling him this, and one was telling him this. One was telling him the great things of God, and the other one was telling him, Moses, you're royalty. You can do anything you want in this great land of Egypt. Think about all the riches that we know of that the Egyptians had. When we look back through historical events, watching all the archaeologists undig artifacts and those kind of things, the world today is even in awe of some of the things they dig up there. It was an amazing place to be. They had everything that a person could want was at their disposal. But notice this verse that I just got through reading refers to the fleeting pleasures of sin. Sin is not going to last. It's the fleeting pleasures. It's only a momentary thing. It happens, it's gone, it's over with. The pleasures of sin just they don't happen. It also acknowledges that sin is fun. It says the pleasures of sin. Sin is fun. That's why we can't turn our back on it sometimes. We enjoy it. Let me tell you something, Thomaston Road. If you're sinning and you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. Whatever it is, you ain't doing it right. And I'm not promoting sin. I'm just saying sin is fun. And that's the thing that keeps us from God. It's the thing that tears at our heart. It's our inner desires that keep us away from choosing God. And Moses contemplated this. At 40 years old, he made the decision. He was not an Egyptian. He was a Hebrew. And what made him make that decision? What are the things in life that made him make that decision? Verse 26. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Did you hear that? He evaluated the reproach of Christ, and he considered it greater than the wealth of Egypt. He was looking to the reward, the reproach of Christ versus the treasures of Egypt. You know, he had to be looking toward the end. He couldn't be looking at what was happening to the Hebrew people at that time. I mean, they were in slavery. They were out being whipped because they wasn't producing enough. The Egyptians were cruel taskmasters. And Moses has seen all this with his eyes. He knows what it's about. He's seen it from the good side. Most of us would be going, I'm glad I'm not there. But Moses chose that route. So why choose the reproach of Christ? Because the payoff with Christ is better than the final reward of the world. Moses, when he was called by God to lead, this is a few years later, when he was called by God to lead the people out of that slavery, made all kinds of excuses. He said, I can't do that. I'm a man, I'm slow of speech. I'm not qualified to do that. He made all kinds of excuses you can think of. It's amazing in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is speaking to the Sanhedrin, he refers to Moses in his speech to the Sanhedrin. And this is what he says. Moses was instructed in all wisdom of the Egyptians. He was mighty in his words and deeds. Think about that. That's not what Moses told God at all. He said, I'm slow of speech. I'm not qualified for this. All of his life, for 40 years, he had been being prepared for this event. He knew how to stand before a king. He knew how to approach him. You know, if I had the opportunity to go meet the Queen of England, I'd fall flat on my face. I wouldn't know the protocol. I wouldn't understand how to do things. There's a certain thing you have to do. There's certain ways you greet royalty. And I don't know those things. Even if I was educated for 2 months in what I needed to do, I'd still miss something, right? He was raised up in this environment. He knew the ways to do that. And he was being prepared to do that. Verse 28, by faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. That's referring back to the plagues. The last one was what? The firstborn of every house was going to die unless the blood was sprinkled over the doorpost. So the Israelites did just that. The Hebrews that were in the camp did just that. They sprinkled the blood over the doorpost so that the death angel would pass over them. It's amazing that this story begins with the Hebrew boys supposed to be put to death by Pharaoh's edict. But the last plague brought death to Pharaoh's house. That's a pretty amazing thing. God has a way of turning the picture around, doesn't he? Moses made a huge decision. And when he chose to follow God rather than live in the riches of Egypt, it'd be a decision most of us would have trouble making. Trying to get away from all the great things in life. I mean, you just think about your own life and think about the things that you have trouble getting away from. Think about the things that you say yes to instead of saying yes to Christ. They don't even compare to the things that Moses was able to do and the things that Moses was able to have in his possession. Nowhere close. Nowhere close. We can't turn our back on those things. We can't go to God. And it's the greatest decision that we ever make. You know, Moses made those decisions, but he didn't change his past. He couldn't. He did change his future. And you know, Moses' life after that wasn't like a bed of roses. He wandered around for 40 years in that wilderness with all these people, right? And then when the time for the great reward came about, he had struck a rock instead of talking to it. And what happened? He got to see the promised land. He got to look on top of a mountain down and see the great river that he hadn't seen for years and years. He got to see all the lush vegetation, but he couldn't enter in there because he messed up. Now, you can't change your past either. But just like Moses and all these people in this hall of faith, you can determine your destiny. By choosing Jesus, he can change your past. He can wipe the books clean of everything that you've ever done that's wrong. That doesn't mean that your friends are not going to forget. That doesn't mean that you may not still have repercussions from things that you've done, but it won't be in the book of life. All those things will be gone. So by choosing Christ, he can change your past. By obedience to him, you can have your past wiped away. You know, there are going to be times when you may feel powerless to make changes in your life. You know, I just can't overcome that stuff. I just can't get away from this. I've tried, and I always end up right back in the same place again. It's because the inner desires are so strong. It's hard for us to overcome. But if you surrender to Christ, he will give you the power to do that. It's not going to be a magical thing. It's not something that's going to just be an easy path of transition. It's going to be things we have to work at. We got to earn it. We have to deserve it. And, you know, you're going to miss the mark. You're going to feel like you can't give up the pleasures of sin. But if you endure, you'll find a great reward. Every person that has ever lived and every person that's going to live is going to make this decision. Whether to choose God or choose the world. Choose its passions. Choose its pleasures. And choose its gods. So today, this is the question. Who is it for you? Is it Christ? Or is it the pleasure or the gods of this world? Moses chose to suffer the affliction with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. All these people listed in this chapter 11 of Hebrews, they all made that decision. That's why they're listed there. No one can make that decision for you. It's a decision that you have to make alone. I can stand up here and talk about the people like Moses and Abraham and all the other people that's listed in Hebrews chapter 11. All those people made that decision, and they got their names listed in that book. But the only book that matters is the book of life. It's the only one that matters. If you're not ready to meet God, if you're not sure your sins are forgiven, if you're not sure that you're going to heaven, you come and make sure today. This day, you can meet God in a new way, a new life. If you put Christ, you can put Christ on baptism today. Time's right now. If you want to learn more about this Savior that we talk about, or if you have things that you want to pray about, the time is right now. There are elders at each of the doors, or you can come down front, and we encourage you to do that as we stand and sing this song.